Fears of renewed chaos in Libya. The eastern-based parliament in Tobruk names a rival to replace the unity government's prime minister, threatening a new power struggle. Will Libya see a further entrenched divide between two rival governments spin out of control? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Libya's political uncertainty. Well, back in December, a much-anticipated election that was supposed to usher in a new era of democracy for Libya was canceled. With no formal electoral laws or an agreeable list of candidates, the delayed vote left UN-appointed Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeibah in charge. Though he claims to be working toward a unified democratic transition, his rivals in the east have lost patience. So on Thursday, Libya's eastern-based parliament appointed former Interior Minister Fathi Bashagha as the country's new prime minister just hours after Dbeibah himself survived an apparent assassination attempt. Now, the Eastern Parliament's move is viewed as a setback to the international political process in the country. The UN says it still recognizes Dbeibah as prime minister, and the appointment of Bashagha is expected to deepen rivalries between Libya's east and the western-based administration in the capital, Tripoli. Still, Bashagha has promised to continue with the democratic transition.
I would like to thank the Government of National Unity, headed by Abdulhamid Dbeibah, who took on the responsibilities during a difficult phase. This is the democracy that ensures a peaceful transition of power, and I am confident that the Government of National Unity will be committed to these democratic principles.
Meanwhile, Dbeibah vowed to continue in his post until elections are held and reiterated his administration's position that he will only hand power to a popularly elected government.
I will accept no new transitional phase, and we will not step up from our role in the government that we promised the people until an election is held. The unity government will proceed with its work until we hand over power to an elected government. I'm honestly concerned from what this dominant political class has been seeking all these years in this country, and afraid that it will drag us once again towards being divided and in chaos. We see them today, with no shame, more and more trying to extend their terms.
Last month, Dbeibah said Libya needed a new constitution before elections could be held. Longtime leader Muammar Gaddafi scrapped the country's last constitution in 1969. He was ousted in a 2011 uprising, and Libya was dragged into civil war. Two rival administrations emerged to run opposite sides of the country. The West, controlled by the internationally recognized Government of National Unity, and the East has been home to warlord Khalifa Haftar's militia, the LNA. UN attempts to establish a legitimate government accepted nationwide have failed, and presidential elections have been postponed indefinitely. As many fear renewed instability, armed groups in Tripoli have been mobilizing in recent months to prepare for possible conflict. Meanwhile, protesters have gathered in front of Tripoli's parliament, rejecting a new transitional stage and demanding an end to the political stalemate.
From my point of view, the current government should remain. There is no point of letting a new government start over for these short periods.
I hope that there won't be two governments leading to division. It's not logical, even if we are for or against this government.
We consider Dbeibah to be better than any other person. Dbeibah is better than Fathi Bashagha.
So, is Libya standing on the precipice of more violence, or is there a way to reshape the country's politics and turn back to the transition to democracy? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Istanbul, Anas Gomati. He is the director of the Libyan think tank, the Sadeq Institute. From London, Umberto Profazio is associate fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And also from London, senior research fellow with Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, Tim Eaton. Thanks all so much for being with us. Anas, you have described this as Groundhog Day, and I know it does feel a bit surreal, but first, I need you to explain really who Fathi Bashagha really is. You know, he was chosen by the Tobruk parliament. It was approved by Khalifa Haftar, but from what we understand, he is not known to be one of Haftar's men. Where do his loyalties lie? What do you think he wants in this position?
I think his loyalties lie where his political career takes him, and I think he's an opportunist, certainly an interesting fellow, because he, as you've rightly said, he was the former Minister of Interior during the battle for Tripoli when Khalifa Haftar's forces launched an onslaught onto the capital, and Khalifa Haftar at that time was labelled by Fathi Bashagha as the opposite of the answer to Libya's solution. He needed to be dead for Libya to be solved, according to individuals like Fathi Bashagha. But as he may view himself as being someone that is pragmatic, I think his detractors have called him lacking in political principle. And I think he had a political constituency that he cultivated over a period of those 2 years when the battle for Tripoli was at its peak. And I believe that he's lost that political constituency, particularly the most powerful constituencies, the armed groups that had fought against Khalifa Haftar. He lost that when he arrived in Benghazi last month, shaking hands with Khalifa Haftar, calling him merely a presidential candidate in the failed elections that took place, or were supposed to take place at the tail end of last year. And today he is just a number of political entrepreneurs looking for political opportunities wherever they may find them.
Okay. Before I move on to our other panelists, I do need you to clarify, actually, though, because you said this feels like Groundhog Day, but, you know, Groundhog Day is a repetition of exactly the same thing over and over, restarting the same cycle. Is that to say, in your opinion, that absolutely no progress has been made, that Libya has been frozen in time, and all this effort to establish this government of national unity and try and reconcile with the Tobruk-based parliament has served for nothing?
It's old wine in new bottles, if you would like. I think the question is, we've seen this film before. There was a parallel administration for 5 years during the last UN-appointed government of, we didn't call it the government of national unity. We called it last time the government of national accord. It was a 9-man presidency last time. This time it's a 3-man presidency. But whichever way the arithmetic goes, whichever way the regionalism go, this is the same film that we've seen before. Now, the question has been, if we look at the different ways in which these bodies have been structured, sometimes we say there was an argument between the parliament in the east and the government in the west, but this government is 8 months old and the parliament in the east is 8 years old. If we go back to the previous conflict, no one knows precisely why there have been this many different disputes, why the wars have taken place, and if the peace processes or political processes are responding to them. What I can say quite clearly is that there seems to be some irreconcilable differences and an irreconcilable vision as to how to structure the post-Gaddafi state over the last decade. And that is a central question that comes to the role of an individual like Khalifa Haftar, who in 2019 tried to prize power from Tripoli. In 2020, his chief ally, Agela Saleh, the chief speaker of the parliament, went for the presidential position with his partner, Fathi Bashagha, to try to prize the government of national unity's presidency and prime ministership. They lost in that vote against Abdulhamid Dbeibah, the current sitting prime minister in Tripoli. Today, they're doing that by setting up a rival administration. But what we know is that it's old wine in new bottles. It is Groundhog Day because the very same actors are still there. This is musical chairs, all but in name. And the same thing that has not been resolved is still there at the precipice. And that is a question about Libya's ideological character and the character of its post-Gaddafi state a decade on from the Arab Spring.
Right. Umberto, I'm assuming you're more or less on the same page there, because you have said there is a need to refresh the political elite in Libya. I mean, how do you do that? And who's actually even waiting in the wings, so to speak, to step in and take over for this aging political elite that keeps repeating this miserable cycle?
Yeah, I think that Anas is right to point at the last year election of the Government of National Unity by the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. This, of course, was a different conjuncture that helped to establish a new government with the help of another body, which was a surrogate body, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. I think that right now we are seeing a resurgence of the Libyan parliament, which is establishing its own political roadmap, which is different from the one of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya, whose role is currently declining. So we are back at where we left with a vote in Geneva last year, in which the list composed by Dbeibah and Menfi won against Saleh and Bashagha, which are now reforming their tandem. They are
Okay. It looks like Umberto's connection has dropped. Okay, let me move on to Tim, though, quickly. I mean, is there any defense of sorts for Bashagha and what he's done? I mean, is it fair for the Eastern government to feel it is, in a sense, its turn? Elections, if they are even held at all, are still a ways off. And in the interest of unity, the East perhaps should be given a chance at leadership. And Dbeibah is just not willing to look at it. So, fine, here they step in this manner.
Well, I think it's very difficult right now to even identify clear fault lines because, is this an Eastern parliament versus a Western government? You've actually got two Misratan protagonists contending for prime minister at the moment and claiming the throne, if you like. The situation's just become so messy. We've seen effectively, since the collapse of the electoral cycle, the collapse of the UN-led process and its replacement by an House of Representatives-led process. And of course, the argument that Bashagha will make is that he is the legitimate prime minister as appointed by the House of Representatives, and that in accordance with Libyan law, he now gets to form a government, and that government should face a vote of confidence. But then the legal arguments in this work both ways. Is Fathi Bashagha actually the head of state? Did that HOR vote meet its own requirements for what a vote needs to take place? When you look at the video, it sure doesn't seem to. And how do you reconcile these elements when you've got an internationally led process appointing the existing government, which was a four-man list selection, let's not forget? Why is only the prime minister being replaced from that? What's happening to the presidency council? Mm-hmm. And what happens next? So within all of this, it seems that whilst both sides will make legal arguments, there are strong and easy ways to beat down those legal arguments. And really what this is about is who can make it stick on the ground, who will get the backing of the internationals, who will be able to control the ground and actually access these offices. And it's a pretty cynical game, I think, in that regard. What we're looking at now is, like Umberto said, a revisiting of that electoral list which was produced by the LPDF. It's the same group of actors. But if you look at the coalition that has helped Fathi Bashagha to get through this House of Representatives vote and arrive in Tripoli, it's quite a motley crew. And it's a group of actors as well that Bashagha has at different times in his political history opposed. So how is he supposed to wield this as any form of government? And what does Dbeibah's government do now? So many questions. It feels like we're very much at an inflection point.
Right. Umberto, I can come back to you. I've been told your line has been corrected. So again, you said there's now this need to replace the political elite, i.e. in part the motley crew that Tim was just describing. I mean, who's there? Are there options?
Not at the moment, I'm afraid, because as we've seen also with the elections, the attempt to refresh the political elite was just the comeback of what the special advisor of the UN mission in Libya, Stephanie Williams, called the political dinosaurs. So even if we had the elections 2 months ago, we had, for example, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, we had Dbeibah himself, and we have Khalifa Haftar. So I think that we are still far away from reaching a point in which we can have a refreshment of the political elite in Libya. But I still have some slight hope compared to my other co-panelists, because I think that these attempts to establish a new government by Dbeibah, by the parliament, which is even discredited and delegitimized because it's not been elected since 2014, there's still an attempt to find a compromise between different factions in Libya, what can be as an historic compromise between the different factions that could help the coalitions and the factions come together to work for the benefit of Libya. And that is what it's all about. At the same time, I have to acknowledge the fact that this could be easily labeled as political bandwagoning because yesterday's enemies are now today's friends. And this could also create the opportunity for a risk of the creating of parallel institutions in Libya, as we've seen since 2014.
Right. Well, it's good to hear, in a sense, that the glass could be half full. from Umberto. But let me go back to Anas and ask, I mean, about, the ceasefire itself and people talking now that this could spiral the country back into violent conflict. Are you that pessimistic, or, I mean, do you recognize that it is a distinct possibility?
Of course, it always remains a distinct possibility for a number of reasons. The fact that, number one, that there are at least 25,000 forces on the ground, foreign forces on the ground, that a stalemate exists, but a real process to reconcile these structural and ideological differences between the competing rival military factions and their networks, that doesn't exist. There is just an agreement to disagree that no side should try to cross over the divide from east to west. And even that has been failed over the last 6 to 8 months. We've seen Khalifa Haftar's forces move into the south of the country and break, or at least punch holes in the ceasefire agreement. Now, when it comes back to the relevance of all of this, I think there is a distinct possibility of a conflict if any of those actors, particularly in terms of what Tim was mentioning, in terms of who controls the ground. Well, that's a key question. If Khalifa Haftar's and Fathi Bashagha, that alliance, attempt to manipulate power dynamics in Tripoli, attempt to try to co-opt certain groups or intimate that they would try to force the government of national unity out of office through military means, an option that doesn't look like it's likely today but could always change tomorrow, that in itself would certainly trigger mobilization because, again, as I've said, we've seen this film before. 2011, 2014, 2019, we saw the mass mobilization and trigger for tens of thousands, if not more, of troops and civilians and forces that picked up arms to move against what they believed was an ideological threat to return the country back to military rule, either under Gaddafi or either under Khalifa Haftar. And today, if that means the soft face of Fathi Bashagha covering the face of Khalifa Haftar, the ideology and the objective or the goal is still the same. And I think that in itself is probably the biggest trigger. If that is a tripwire that they end up tripping, then essentially that's the way that things will move. And I think that's where conflicts start and arise. But today what we see is tensions, and I don't think that we're seeing the possibility for an all-out conflict yet. Fathi Bashagha landed last night in Tripoli and gave a press conference. Presumably his rhetoric is just to ignore the fact that there is a government in Tripoli. If that was to move to a phase 2 and they were to try to manipulate dynamics on the ground, as I've said, that would lead to a conflict.
Right. I mean, Tim, let me come back to you because I guess the issue is the East doesn't feel that there is a government in Tripoli because that government was supposed to have disappeared with an election that was supposed to have taken place. And at any rate, they accused, Dbeibah of wanting to hold on to power illegally because he was not supposed to bid for the presidency and then put himself forward as a candidate. So at this point, is it antagonistic for Dbeibah? Does he have actually the right to say, as he said, that he will accept no transitional phase of parallel authority? Is it okay for him to say that when he was not popularly elected either, or does that just antagonize Tobruk?
Well, I think what you're seeing is a very fragmented situation where you've got people on either side of aisles looking to form deals, perhaps forming deals with both candidates. From Dbeibah's perspective, I think he can legitimately argue that he was appointed by the LPDF. The LPDF roadmap elapses in June, and that he should be replaced by an elected government. That is the LPDF roadmap. The issue for Dbeibah, in a way, that whilst he has himself broken his promise in the past that he wouldn't run, he's now relying on an LPDF that the international community doesn't actually seem interested in supporting itself right now. So if you look over the last week or so, there haven't been a lot of strong words of support for Dbeibah. So clinging on to that international process as his justification is more difficult when the internationals aren't backing that up. That's not to say that he can't make that argument. The arguments made from the HOR are similarly, you need some quite mental gymnastics to follow the arguments that are made legally by Aguila Saleh. If you look, one of the major reasons that the elections process collapsed was because Aguila unilaterally announced elections laws and didn't even submit them to a vote in the House. On top of that, the vote of no confidence in the GNU was many months ago and seemed to call upon UN processes as well and didn't seem to have the necessary quorum.
Yeah.
So clearly the legal process is secondary to the political goal in all of these elements.
Okay.
And so we've seen that. And if you look around the elections, everybody was able to get a court decision in their favor and there's no way of adjudicating them. So what's kind of happening is that people are relying on their own justification. But the reality is It's whether you can make it stick.
Right.
And so I think that creates an interesting dynamic right now between those forces on the ground in Tripoli, particularly those of Misratan origin, with two Misratan candidates. What do they do?
Okay. I mean, does this bring us back then, Umberto? I can return to you. I mean, it is to a fear that the time will come after so many delays and debacles that, these two separate governments will simply become the status quo because there is no unifying leadership.
There is certainly a risk for this, and as we see, this is a déjà vu. I think that the interesting point to make here is to understand how the situation is completely different to the one that led to the establishment of the government of national unity. Because that conjuncture was people waiting for the new US administration coming in and trying to engage with the Libyan stakeholders, especially after the tumultuous year of the Trump administration and the war and the war in Tripoli in 2019, 2020. And that gave a window of opportunity to the internationals to establish the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, and that led to the establishment of the government of national unity. Now this window of opportunity has passed, and we've seen the House of Representatives trying to reassert its leadership on the UN process. And for me, we also see the decline of the action of the United Nations support mission in Libya, which was evident by the resignation of the former UN envoy Jan Kubis, and the difficulty in renewing the mandate of the United Nations support mission in Libya. So to simplify, we have a situation now in which we have the House of Representatives versus the international community, and we have seen that the Libyans are trying to reassert their authority, and it's difficult for the internationals right now to claim that they want a Libyan-owned and a Libyan-led solution, while at the same time going against the decision of the House of Representatives, which I want to highlight that I think that is a discredited body, a delegitimized body, but is still in the trying to speak for the Libyans themselves.
Okay. Anas, we have just a couple minutes left, so I'll let you speak as well on what you think, where all this leaves international interests in the country. And if you can as well, another issue of fear here is that some are saying this kind of destabilization presents some opportunities for Daesh in Libya. Is that a concern for you as well?
I think that's always going to be a concern, but the real concern is how Daesh can be used as a political tool to end up calling the entire civilian population of Tripoli Daesh. And that was the case over the last several years. It was the case in Benghazi between 2014 and 2017. And I think that's where I'm more concerned when the cynical use of counterterrorism is used to bombard an entire civilian population and to leave Libya covered in crime scene tape, as it has been now for over a decade. That is the case with many of the presidential candidates. Where does this leave us going forward? I mean, everything in Libya has become a political tool or has become a weapon in the war to take control of the country's destiny. Libya's 2.5 million registered voters were given the illusion that they would be able to fulfill their democratic right at the elections under conditions that absolutely no democracy on earth would be able to withstand, where there is absolute tyranny against the Libyan judiciary, where presidential candidates and presidential candidates were literally attacked whilst they were canvassing for popular support across the country. So again, these are the kind of conditions where democracy can't sprout, where, as I said earlier on, the parliamentary elections law was passed without a parliamentary vote. It was passed by decree, and it was tailored to allow these actors to move forward with almost no self-sacrifice. And that is really the key dilemma today, is that by giving the keys of Libya's solution to the very actors responsible for the conflict and hoping that they will perform some sort of self-sacrifice, that they will just basically become altruistic, is a nightmare and is a joke at its best. And I think that's where basically the UN needs to return back to the Berlin process, the process that it established over 2 years ago, shortly before COVID, and perform a hard reset on these institutions that shouldn't be rewarded with guiding Libya towards its democratic future, but should be eroded from having the ability to spoil the political process, to spoil the democratic transition, and to having unfortunately covered Libya, as I said, with crime scene tape and war crimes over the last few years.
Okay, Anas Gomati, Umberto Profazio, and Tim Eaton, thank you so much for being with us on this edition of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciate all your perspective and insights, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.